Thank you for joining us, and welcome to this first episode of Celebrating Stained Glass in the Northland. My name is Bob Lowe, and I'll be your host today. In this episode, we will learn about the beautiful stained glass in Pilgrim Congregational Church, United Church of Christ. Pilgrim Church is located on the east hillside of Duluth, Minnesota. The building you see today, with its bell tower rising above the trees of the east hillside, is the third structure in the church's history. The church's location today is at 2310 East 4th Street. Construction of the church took place from 1916 to 1917. The sanctuary has an auditorium-style design as its floor slopes down toward the chancel, the front portion of the sanctuary. High up in the back of the sanctuary is the massive church organ. It was built in Duluth by the Jack Corporation. If members at Pilgrim had to choose a signature feature of their church, it would likely be the impressive Roberts Memorial window above the chancel in the sanctuary's southwest wall. The Roberts window was funded by a bequest from Arthur Roberts as a memorial to his first wife, Catherine Matter Roberts, and his widow, Mary McGonigal Roberts. The window was designed by Odell Prather and was fabricated by Conway Universal Studios, who also installed the window in 1979. A Kansas native, Odell Prather also designed the stained glass windows for the crypt of the Eisenhower Presidential Library in Abilene, Kansas, and the J. Edgar Hoover Memorial window in Capitol Hill Methodist Church, Washington, D.C. The design committee for the Roberts window was originally opposed to any pictorial representations in the window. This opposition may have been as a result of the long-standing tradition in Congregationalist churches of showing restraint in the use of religious symbols, such as crosses, vestments, statues, and other objects that had the potential to become idolatrous. But in the case of the Roberts window, Royal Shepherd, Pilgrim's minister at the time, advocated for placing the symbol of the United Church of Christ, the crown, the cross, and the orb, at the center of the window, even though the window's benefactor, the late Arthur Roberts, may himself have opposed it. Other schematic images in the window also have a religious connotation, albeit less conspicuous, such as the flame of the Holy Spirit, the star of incarnation, and the holy city of Jerusalem. But the window also has an educational theme, which was suggested by Prather. A number of buildings from a variety of college campuses are depicted. All of these schools have a historic connection to the United Church of Christ. Some of the colleges represented include Harvard, Yale, Oberlin College, which is the alma mater of Catherine Roberts, Mount Holyoke College, which is the alma mater of Mary Roberts, and Northland College in nearby Ashland, Wisconsin. In the afternoon, sunlight comes through the Roberts window and makes a colorful palette on the side wall. And then in the winter months, when the sun is really low in the sky, colored light from the window is at a low enough angle to illuminate the organ. If the Roberts window is the newest stained glass window at Pilgrim, then perhaps the oldest are the ones that were moved from the previous church location on Lake Avenue and 2nd Street. This window, the Munger Memorial window in the ceiling of the 2nd-story chapel, was one of those that was salvaged. It clearly has an overt religious context, and therefore is an exception to the generally temporal, decorative style of the church. The Woodbridge Memorial windows, a set of 4, were also salvaged from the previous church on Lake Avenue. The Woodbridge windows are located at the south end of the narthex. Once again, they too are an exception to the temporal design style of the church. These windows were purchased in Paris in 1888. Although they are often referred to as the 4 evangelists, that characterization is not entirely correct. The first figure on the far left, however, is likely St. Matthew. Why St. Matthew was depicted with 6 toes on each foot is not known. The next window to the right is likely St. Peter. In Matthew chapter 16, verse 19, Jesus says to Peter, "I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven." Apostle Paul is likely portrayed in the 3rd window, since the figure is holding a sword, an iconic feature that is associated with Paul. Tradition states that since Paul was a Roman citizen, he was executed by means of beheading with a sword, rather than by crucifixion. Another indication that the 3rd figure is the Apostle Paul is that his right hand holds a scroll, which likely represents his epistles. At the bottom of the 3rd window is the name of the maker of this set of 4 windows, J.B. Anglade, whose work had won a silver medal at the 1878 Paris Universal Exposition. The connection to Anglade was made through Roger Munger, a longtime Pilgrim trustee, whose brother Gilbert lived in Paris. Gilbert Munger was a talented American landscape painter. The 4th figure on the far right is almost certainly St. John, the evangelist, who is often depicted with an eagle, a symbol of John's emphasis of the divine and mystical nature of Christ. The most famous stained glass windows in Pilgrim Church are likely the 5 pairs of Tiffany windows that are on the main floor of the sanctuary. They were installed between 1918 and 1932. The 4 Tiffany windows on the south wall are the most striking. In fact, these 4 windows are a favorite for at least one member at Pilgrim Church.
My name is Denny Falk, and I've been a member of Pilgrim Church for over 30 years. I'm sitting this morning in a pew that I sit in on most Sunday mornings, and I choose to sit here because this particular location affords me a view of all 4 Tiffany windows on the south aisle of the sanctuary. I start from the top of the sanctuary near the narthex, and as I go down the aisle, I see first of all 2 scenes that remind me of the English countryside. Following on down the aisle, I see the Barnes window that is filled with irises, and finally down to the Duncan window that includes my particular favorite, that being the daffodils.
The Duncan Haggart window and its daffodils isn't just the favorite of Denny Falk. This window, dedicated on June 3, 1928, is also a favorite for none other than the direct descendants of Charles Duncan and William Haggart.
My name is Carolyn Sundquist. I'm the great-granddaughter of William Gustav Haggart, and I'm sitting in front of the Duncan Haggart window at Pilgrim Congregational Church, and next to me is the Duncan from the Duncan Haggart window.
I'm Lynn Duncan. I'm the grandson of Charles Duncan and one of 4 remaining grandchildren of Charles A. Duncan. This window in this church is dedicated to Charles Duncan and Mr. Haggart, and I have been very fond of it for years and years. Unfortunately, I never knew my grandfather. He died about 6 years before I was born, and I was born in 1930. But I knew my grandmother, his wife, who attended this church for many, many years until her death in 1947.
And sitting on my lap here is a doll named for Lynn's grandmother. This is Mrs. Charles Duncan, Ina Duncan, because the 2 families were very close friends. And when my mother was born at the house I now live in on East 6th Street, Mrs. Duncan lived just kitty corner and gave this doll Ina, to my mother as a child, and so my mother named it for the gift giver. So her name is Ina Duncan. Well, both my great-grandfather, William Gustav Haggart, and Charles Duncan were best of friends, and they were also very active here at Pilgrim Church. My great-grandfather was treasurer of the building committee. Well, both men had died at the time that the church decided to commission and install Tiffany windows here. So the story in the family is that my great-grandmother went to the Tiffany studios in New York and actually picked out the window. And when she came back to Duluth, she had heard that Mrs. Duncan, Ina Duncan, wanted to do a window in honor of her husband, who had also died. So because the men were very close friends, great-grandmother approached Mrs. Duncan and said, why don't we go in together on the window? So they together purchased what is now known as the Duncan Haggart window, and it's memorialized to Lynn's grandfather and my great-grandfather.
My grandmother always sat in the pew just right behind us here after Grandpa had died, because it was close to the window which memorialized he and Mr. Haggart. One of the things that Pilgrim Church did a few years ago was to duplicate a window that was similar to or is the picture of this window behind us. I believe they used it for a fundraising type activity. Today I know that the Glen Sheen Mansion store also is carrying this window today. But it's kind of nice to have it. I know all those in my family that are still living have this in their homes as we do. And it's a real nice thing to remind us of the beauty of this window. I think it's interesting to note that the relatives of my family and my brothers and sisters, when my brothers were alive, used to come here, as did my father, who left Duluth in 1942 to go to Portland, Oregon. But every time he returned to Duluth, this was one of his main stops, was to stop and see this gorgeous window. And he was very proud of it, and as I am, and the family are. And it's a beautiful addition to this church. And I think Mrs. Haggard and my grandmother had great foresight in picking out that beautiful window for this church.
And Lynn and I and the other family members are proud that whenever there are reproductions or prints made of the Tiffany windows at Pilgrim Church and stained glass windows in Duluth, our family window happens to be the one that seems to have the most prominent place. So you're right, Lynn. The two ladies had very good taste.
In terms of the order when the Tiffany windows were installed, the Duncan Haggart window was actually the last one installed on the south wall. The first Tiffany window installed on the south wall is immediately to the left of the Duncan Haggart window. It is commonly referred to as the Barnes window, and it has the beautiful irises mentioned earlier. The formal title of the Barnes window is Early Morning. It was with this window that installing Tiffany windows at Pilgrim Church became a tradition. Julius Barnes was not only successful as a grain exporter and shipbuilder, he helped convince Congress of the need for the St. Lawrence Seaway. Colleges such as Harvard honored him with honorary degrees, and he believed in our youth, as he used his own money to help build Duluth's YMCA.
Julius Barnes is a very interesting person in the history of Duluth. He was an industrialist and worked with Herbert Hoover during the relief efforts of after World War I. And he also had an office in Manhattan on the Upper West Side, not too far from the Tiffany Studios. In February of 1918, only 2 months after the first church service, the first Tiffany window dedicated to Julius Barnes' parents was dedicated. Shortly thereafter, his sister, Henrietta, who had married a gentleman named Fields, dedicated the second window, having procured it again from Tiffany.
That covers the history of the Tiffany windows here at Pilgrim. There's another aspect to the story, and that's to talk about their beauty and how they were created. Louis Tiffany's motto, "Nature is always beautiful," explains why each window has a landscape design that is indeed beautiful. But it is 3 techniques that he used to achieve that beauty. Of the 4 Tiffany windows on the south wall, the Hoops window, the one farthest to the left, best displays all 3 techniques. First, Tiffany avoided the use of painted glass and instead used glass that was opalescent. Secondly, Tiffany incorporated broken glass fragments into the design. He did this by pouring molten glass over the broken fragments. And Tiffany used the technique of plating, where two or more sections of glass are layered together. There are 3 other stained glass windows on the main floor of the sanctuary, and they are along the north wall. The 5th and last Tiffany window, the Matter window, is one of the windows along the north wall. It is the farthest one down the aisle, and it was dedicated in 1932. To the right of the Matter window are the only 2 windows on the sanctuary floor that were not made by Tiffany.
I also enjoy the windows from the Westminster studios that are described as a successor studio to Tiffany. They're different in the sense that they have painted glass rather than the translucent glass that I enjoy so much from the Tiffany windows, but have a beauty all of their own. Another important set of windows in the church we refer to as the history windows, and they are located in the front entrance to the church. These windows depict important historical scenes in the life of the Congregational Church. One of the most important is that of John Robinson, who was the minister of the Pilgrims in the Old World. And as those travelers left for the New World, John Robinson said, "Don't forget that the Lord has more truth and light to break forth out of his holy word."
The Robinson quote is at the top of the Weaver Memorial window. Of the 2 history windows, the Weaver window is on the right. The window to the left is the Walker Memorial window. The 2 history windows were dedicated in 1957. Each window contains 3 historical scenes that were researched by William Halfacher, Pilgrim's minister from 1952 to 1971. Halfacher sent his findings to the designer, Edward Layton. The top scene of the Weaver window, John Robinson's Pastoral Counsel, is part of an overall theme that involves 2 groups of English dissenters, the Puritans and the Pilgrims. They were the predecessors to the Congregational Church in America. The middle scene in the window is titled The Signing of the Mayflower Compact. The 41 men who signed this document in 1620 agreed to form a government in their new colony. The bottom scene shows Thomas Hooker delivering a speech on May 1, 1639, to the Independent General Court, a legislative body of communities in present-day Connecticut. The communities had withdrawn from the Massachusetts Bay Colony to form their own government. At Hooker's urging, the communities adopted the Fundamental Orders, a set of self-governing principles. The scene shows this quote by Hooker: "The foundation of authority is laid in the free consent of the people." The top scene in the Walker window depicts the founding of Harvard College. In planning the design, William Halfacher wrote to the dean of the Harvard Divinity School, who suggested this phrase from a Harvard fundraising pamphlet published in London back in 1643: "To advance learning and perpetuate it to posterity." Various items are shown in the Harvard scene, including a gift of £800 and the original wording of the founding resolution that established the college name, Harvard. The middle scene depicts the haystack prayer meeting in Williamstown, Massachusetts, 1806. It was the start of the American Protestant missionary movement. 5 students were discussing missionary service when a thunderstorm struck, forcing them to take shelter under a haystack. The scene shows the lightning during the thunderstorm, a monument that was erected to commemorate the haystack meeting, and 2 missionaries teaching people in faraway lands. The bottom scene shows Lyman Abbott delivering an anti-slavery sermon at the First Congregational Church in Terre Haute, Indiana, 1860. William Halfacher had been a minister at the same church himself and found a copy of Abbott's sermon while he was there. Above Abbott's head is a quote from his anti-slavery sermon. God is showing the inherent weakness of all forms of government not founded on the law of love. In fact, the flaming heart image in the lower right-hand corner symbolizes love or charity. Also in the scene is a runaway slave, a train representing the Underground Railway, and a stained glass window from the Terre Haute Church. The window's image shows an anchor, which is a symbol of hope. Lyman Abbott would become an influential clergyman in America. In fact, it was one of America's most influential clergymen, Henry Ward Beecher, who recommended Abbott for the position at Terre Haute in the first place. As you now can see, the history windows point out a pattern. The scenes depict stories about people who established a historical legacy. But the establishment of historical legacies never really ends, and they seem to become apparent only in hindsight. And the people who influence the story of stained glass have now themselves become a historical legacy that belongs to Pilgrim Congregational Church in Duluth, Minnesota. That wraps up our first episode celebrating stained glass in the Northland. Thank you for joining us.